He handed over his black credit card, dressed sharp, calm, composed. And still, the hotel clerk looked him up and down like he didn't belong there, then loudly claimed the card was probably maxed out, just loud enough for the lobby to hear. That was the moment it started, not with violence, not with a smirk, a swipe, and a quiet decision to humiliate. A black man who had done nothing wrong except walk into a sink. What followed wasn't just about one hotel or one insult. It unraveled everything. So before the truth comes out, before positions flip and legacies fall, ask yourself this: how much damage can a single moment of arrogance cause when the wrong person gets underestimated? Stick around, because this is the story of what happens when quiet dignity meets systemic discrimination. And the ending isn't what anyone expects. If stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe, drop a comment with where you're watching from, and tell us, have you ever seen something like this happen in real life? The Lancaster Grand was more than a hotel. It was a symbol. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above imported marble floors, and the lobby buzzed softly with the quiet confidence of wealth. Eden Miles stood behind the reception desk like a sentinel. He wasn't just processing check-ins, he was protecting status. When Daniel Whitaker stepped up to the counter, there was no disruption in the atmosphere. Only a subtle pause. Daniel was tall, composed, dressed in a steel gray jacket over a crisp white shirt. He handed over his reservation details and a black Centurion card without flourish, without hesitation. Ethan glanced at it, then at Daniel, and didn't reach for the terminal. Instead, he held the card between two fingers, inspecting it like it might be counterfeit. His smile was professional but cool. Just one of those cards, he said offhandedly. Sometimes they trigger errors. Daniel gave a brief nod, unbothered. Go ahead and try. Ethan inserted the card at an angle that ensured it would fail. The machine beeped. Error. He removed it, tried again. Another error. Behind Daniel, a woman in designer sunglasses nudged her husband and whispered. They both smirked. Daniel remained silent. Ethan cleared his throat. Some guests prefer Visa for hotel authorizations. Daniel took the card back without a word and reinserted it himself. The screen flashed green. Approved. The smirk on Ethan's face twitched, then vanished. He tapped his keyboard. Ah, looks like we've had to adjust some assignments. Your room's been changed. Daniel's gaze sharpened. I booked the Skyline Suite. 1901. Ethan shrugged. Due to a last-minute logistical reassignment, we've moved you to 415. Comparable, of course. Still lovely. A service hallway view. Fluorescent lighting. Daniel accepted the key card, but not the excuse. As Daniel walked away, Ethan typed a quick message into the hotel's internal chat system. Security. Flag room 415 for passive monitoring. Guest appears to be suspicious. Paul Decker, the hotel's director of security, caught the message on his tablet as he stood near the west exit. His eyes rose slowly, scanning the crowd until they found Daniel's silhouette near the elevator. He gave a subtle signal to one of his men, who stepped into motion. The young officer, black like Daniel, moved quietly, not drawing attention, shadowing the hallway leading to the elevators. Daniel felt it. Of course he did. He didn't look back. He simply stepped into the elevator, pressed the button for floor 4, and watched the doors close without urgency. Inside the mirrored walls, his reflection held still. He'd seen this before. He'd lived this before. But not like this. Not in this building. Not under these stakes. The hallway of the 4th floor was dimmer, colder. Room 415 sat at the far end, past the laundry chute, near the supply closet. Daniel opened the door, stepped inside, and let it close behind him. The room was clean, standard, unremarkable. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and detergent. He set his suitcase down gently, walked to the window, and stared out at a brick wall. Then he pulled out his phone and opened a secure messaging app. They've moved me. Manual override. Observation requested. Code priority unchanged. Sent. Then he turned off the screen. He didn't pace. He didn't fume. He simply waited. Below, Ethan had returned to his post, already dealing with the next guest, another man in a tailored coat. But this one didn't raise any flags. No extra scans. No questions. No reassignment. Ethan processed the booking in 30 seconds flat. Behind the scenes, security watched the hallway outside 415, logging every moment Daniel stepped out of the room. The camera didn't record audio, but the silence was telling. No complaints, no confrontation, just presence. To the staff, that was provocation enough. That evening, while reviewing the guest profiles for the week, the hotel manager paused at Daniel's name. There was a note next to it now, flagged for escalation if behavior changes. And still, no one asked the question they should have. No one wondered why someone, with that card, that reservation, and that demeanor, had been flagged in the first place. It didn't matter to them. Assumption was enough. After all, someone like Daniel couldn't really belong here. Daniel knew all of it. Every angle, every camera, every keystroke from the desk. Because Daniel Whitaker didn't just stay at the Lancaster Grand. He audited it. His firm oversaw compliance reviews for global hospitality groups. The stay was part of an unannounced equity audit, assigned after prior reports of racial profiling. Ethan's card reader errors, the downgrade the Sustainits had helped design. The game had already begun. Daniel approached without hesitation, requesting to confirm his itinerary for the spa appointment, listed in his premium package. Ethan blinked, paused, and then leaned forward slightly, voice quieter than yesterday but no less patronizing. "Sir, before I assist you, do you happen to have a second form of ID?" Daniel's expression did not change, but something in the air around him did. He took out a state-issued ID card and placed it beside his passport, already scanned at check-in, already approved. Ethan examined them as if he were inspecting forged documents, taking his time, flipping one over slowly. "These are fine," he said eventually, "but would you mind waiting while I verify a few things?" Daniel said nothing, only stepped back with the quiet dignity of a man accustomed to injustice but never broken by it. 10 feet away, another guest approached, an older white man in golf attire, accompanied by a younger woman in heels. They were loud, laughing, the woman snapping her gum while the man shouted a room number to Ethan without being asked. Ethan greeted them with exaggerated cheer, tapping twice on the screen and handing over their key cards, without a word about identification or protocol. The man winked at him. "You know how to take care of real guests, son." Ethan laughed, nodded, and didn't glance once at Daniel still standing nearby, watching it all. Women looked Daniel over and muttered, "Did you see his shoes? Bet he's trying to impress someone," the man replied, "or sneak into somewhere he doesn't belong." They walked past him, still chuckling. Ethan didn't correct them. He never even looked in Daniel's direction. Daniel returned to his room briefly and reviewed the notes he'd taken from the night before. Internal flags logged in the hotel's back-end system, camera angles, timestamps. Every move they made was part of a wider pattern. He knew the protocol because he'd helped write it for institutions that claimed to be anti-bias, but rarely lived up to it. This hotel wasn't just failing, it was weaponizing discretion. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the front desk to request access to the executive lounge, a service included in his suite package. Ethan's assistant, a young woman named Claire, checked the system and hesitated. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not seeing the lounge access linked to your profile." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Would you mind seeking again?" "It's included in my room tier." Claire scanned again, frowning, but before she could speak, Ethan appeared from the back office. "That's correct," he said. "That benefit isn't usually offered unless it's specifically granted by management." Daniel looked at him carefully. "It was included when I booked." Ethan nodded slowly, pretending to type something. "Unfortunately, our system sometimes overpromises. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do." An hour later, Daniel sat in the hotel's cafe, watching as the same couple from the morning breezed into the executive lounge without pause. They hadn't even gone to the front desk. Ethan had granted them clearance directly. Inputting the code manually, Daniel had seen it on the mirrored reflection from his corner seat. He sipped his espresso and opened the laptop resting in front of him. The program running on it showed real-time metadata from the hotel's internal network. Names of guests, status changes, manual overrides. Ethan had tagged Daniel's profile with a custom field labeled "Needs double verification." That wasn't protocol. That was prejudice disguised as discretion. Daniel typed a report entry, quiet fingers moving steadily over the keyboard. Phase 2 complete. Behavior escalating. No corrective interventions by management. Proceed to monitoring final stage. He didn't stop typing even when the manager walked past him without a nod. At sunset, Daniel stepped outside onto the garden terrace, watching the skyline shift into golden amber. He knew what was coming. Subtle disrespect always snowballed before it shattered. The longer it went unchecked, the deeper the rot revealed itself. And tonight, that decay would surface. Across the terrace, Ethan stood speaking with another employee, gesturing discreetly toward Daniel. A third staff member joined them. Daniel caught every glance. He had no interest in interrupting. He had no need to speak. The hotel had already written his story for him. They just didn't realize he was writing theirs. His phone buzzed gently in his pocket. Message was short. Legal team on standby, send final packet within 24 hours. Daniel exhaled slowly. He would. And when he did, no one in this building would see it coming. Inside, Ethan returned to his station, smug and unchallenged, still convinced he was preserving the integrity of the hotel's standards. He had no idea that every bypassed policy, every unequal treatment, every second form of ID requested was evidence, carefully logged, irrefutable. The man he had profiled wasn't just a guest. He was the man the board would be meeting about by Monday morning. I hope everything's to your liking, sir, though I imagine some guests find this place a bit aspirational. The sentence landed with a thud beneath the marble dome of the lobby. A few heads turned. Daniel paused. He didn't flinch. Ethan's grin widened. I only say that because our executive guests often prefer simpler accommodations when traveling for business. Something about atmosphere. Another guest, a college-aged man, his expression was unreadable, but his lens was focused. Daniel didn't respond. He simply asked for a copy of his invoice, which Ethan claimed was being processed, though no request had been made. Ethan tapped at the keyboard, slow, theatrical, buying time or provoking more. The guest with the phone kept recording. Ethan shifted, then stepped from behind the desk, gesturing toward the business center in full view of the lobby's seated guests. If you'd like to wait over there, sir, I'm sure we can find something that fits your preferences. A small pause, just long enough. Of course, if there are budget concerns, we also have affiliate properties more tailored to transitional travelers. His voice was polished, calm, and condescending. Daniel remained silent. His eyes held steady, but the lobby felt like it had dropped 5 degrees. A group of women seated near the fireplace fell silent, watching. A man in a navy suit leaned back to listen more clearly. Ethan turned to Claire, who had joined him behind the desk, and said, loudly enough for others to hear, "Flag his profile for." Daniel finally moved. He turned toward the elevator, leaving without a word. Behind him, the guest with the phone stopped recording and glanced down at his screen. Something had shifted, and it was on video. Within the hour, the footage was online. The video opened with Ethan smirking, his voice clear. Aspirational. Budget concerns. Transitional travelers. Each phrase landed harder than the last. The comment section exploded. Who talks to guests like that? One wrote. This is racism, another posted within minutes by several travel influencers, then amplified by activists who recognized the language for what it was. Microaggression, they called it. Professional humiliation. One thread titled it Elegance Under Fire and featured Daniel's calm posture as a lesson in restraint. Within 3 hours, the hotel's name was trending, not for luxury, not for service, but for disrespect. By midnight, a regional journalist contacted the hotel's PR team for a statement. They issued none. Comments were closed. Reviews on travel platforms plummeted from 5 stars to 2.4. Screenshots of the hotel's past controversies resurfaced. Disparities in service, questionable terminations, low diversity in leadership. Daniel said nothing. He didn't have to. He let the storm build on its own, but inside room 415 he filed the last entries of his audit. Ethan's actions were now not only ethically indefensible but legally compromising. The terms of Daniel's assignment allowed immediate escalations when hostile treatment became public and systemic. The file was nearly complete. One more infraction, one more exposure, and the trigger would be pulled. But Daniel wasn't finished observing. There was always more beneath the surface. And he wasn't here just to expose a man. He was here to expose a pattern. The next morning, Ethan entered the back office and found the general manager standing beside a conference call screen. His jaw was tight. He turned to Ethan slowly. We've been asked to suspend discretionary guest flagging until further notice. Ethan blinked. Excuse me? The GM pointed to the phone. That came from corporate. Ethan frowned, folding his arms. This is about the guest in 415, isn't it? He lied about his credentials. The GM shook his head. He didn't lie. You assumed. And now we're under review. Ethan said nothing, but behind his eyes, panic had begun to set in. He didn't know who Daniel was, but someone higher up did. And they were not pleased. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in the cafe near the window, watching morning traffic flow past the glass. The same student who had recorded the video walked in and approached quietly. "Sir, I didn't mean to be disrespectful," he said. People need to see what this looks like." Daniel nodded. He didn't scold. He didn't thank him. He simply said, "Let truth speak for itself." The young man nodded and left. Daniel stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon ringing once against porcelain. He had watched prejudice for years in boardrooms, in banks, in polished offices, where bias wore tailored suits and shook hands warmly before slamming doors. Ethan wore a hardened mask of composure, but inside, his confidence had cracked. In the manager's office, emails pinged with subject lines like, "You are Ghent complaint response and media such pending." The PR director drafted apologies that legal refused to approve. No one mentioned Daniel directly, but his name had become an invisible force, bending the posture of every employee who passed him. Late that afternoon, as Daniel waited in the lobby for a scheduled car service, two uniformed security guards approached from opposite ends of the room. Subtle, but synchronized, their steps measured. "Sir, would you mind stepping outside with us for a moment?" Daniel glanced at them, unblinking. "What for?" he asked. "Hotel policy," the shorter one said. "We've received concerns. We'd like to resolve them privately." Daniel didn't move. "What concerns? I've made no requests, caused no disturbance." The guard said nothing. The taller one gestured again. "This way, please." Guests nearby pretended not to watch, their eyes hidden behind sunglasses or laptop screens. But everyone was listening. Daniel rose, straightened his cuffs, and walked with them without protest. They led him to a side exit near the valet stand, a space just far enough from view to insulate the hotel from accountability, but close enough for the cameras to miss nothing. Once outside, the taller guard lowered his voice. "We've been asked to remove you from shared spaces until further notice." He handed Daniel a folded printout. It was a temporary restriction notice, showing no notice. Daniel read it once, then again, then folded it neatly and placed it in his coat pocket. His phone buzzed. A push notification. Room key access denied. Digital lock disabled. He was no longer just flagged, he was frozen out. Daniel remained calm, though the implications were unmistakable. He was now being physically distanced, cordoned off like a threat. The guards made no move to escort him farther. One shifted his stance, visibly uneasy. "Sir, we're just following instructions." Daniel didn't speak. He simply nodded once and pulled out his phone. In a secure app, he logged the time, location, and the language used. He took a photo of the printed restriction. Everything documented. Across the city, his compliance team would receive the update in real time. 20 minutes later, Claire, the assistant concierge, arrived at the side exit with a tray bottled water, hand towel, a forced smile. "Mr. Whitaker, we apologize for the inconvenience. We've arranged for a new room back at the hotel's golden crest on the door." He knew what this was. An extraction. A sanitized removal of the problem guest. But he wasn't leaving. Claire's smile faltered as Daniel declined the offer without raising his voice. "I paid for this space. I haven't violated any rules. You're asking me to leave because others are uncomfortable with my presence. That's not policy, that's bias." Claire blinked. "Sir, I understand, but please." "We're under pressure." "Pressure from whom?" Daniel asked. A pause. "From people who don't know who I am, or from people who do?" She said nothing. Behind her, the security guards shifted again. One checked his radio. The tension pulsed beneath the surface like an exposed wire. Then Daniel reached into his coat and retrieved a business card. He handed it to Claire. No threats, no raised tone. Just a name, a title, and a seal that made her eyes widen. "If you're going to remove me," he said, Make sure you understand who you're removing." Her hands trembled slightly as she took the card. She turned without a word and disappeared into the building. Inside, Ethan watched the scene unfold on a monitor in the back office. He saw the exchange, saw the card, then saw Claire's face change. His gut twisted. Something had shifted. He stood quickly and left the office, heading toward the manager's suite, knocking hard. "We may have a problem," he said through the door. The GM entered without waiting and placed a tablet on the desk. "Play this." The video from the security feed looped the moment Daniel handed Claire the card. The GM's face changed instantly. "Is this real?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "I think we misjudged him." The GM stood up straight. "Then undo it. Now." But it was already too late. Across the hotel's internal network, an admin-level override had already been issued. Room access reinstated. People weren't just outraged by what they saw. They were stunned by how calmly Daniel had endured it. His silence had become a symbol of quiet power, a dignified mirror held up to institutional prejudice. Inside the Lancaster Grand, staff refreshed their phones in growing panic, watching the view count climb past 1 million. Emails from corporate began flooding department heads, requesting transcripts, timestamps, and a full report on the treatment of guest Daniel Whitaker. And then, the whisper came. He might not just be a guest. He might be connected. Or worse, he might be auditing them. Fear spread faster than fast. That fear reached the staff lounge, where a junior night clerk named Mason sat at a back table reading the employee handbook with a highlighter. Mason had only worked at the hotel for 6 weeks, but he had already seen more than he was comfortable with. Double standards in check-in protocols, extra scrutiny on certain guests, back-office jokes that weren't really jokes. He had once overheard Ethan referring to a group of black guests as a risk cluster, and it hadn't left his mind. Watching the footage now, Mason made a choice. He opened his company email, wrote a brief message addressed to the internal ethics officer, and attached a bullet-point list of incidents he'd personally witnessed since his first week. He ended the email with a line, "I believe what happened to Mr. Whitaker is not isolated. I believe it reflects a pattern." He hit send, closed the laptop, and sat back in silence. The room around him buzzed with gossip, but Mason had already stepped into something far deeper. 20 minutes later, Mason was called to the back office. He entered expecting questions, maybe even thanks. Instead, he was met by the head of human resources and a legal advisor from corporate who had flown in that afternoon. Their smiles were cold. They didn't mention his email. Instead, they asked about procedural deviations, whether he had ever overridden room assignments, whether he had contact with Daniel Whitaker outside professional duties. Mason answered honestly, but the tone of the conversation chilled him. "You understand," they said, "that internal communication is subject to review. You're not being disciplined, but we are placing you on temporary leave while we assess this matter." Mason nodded once, stunned. He left the office with a security escort and an unsigned envelope labeled confidential in his hand. He didn't speak. He didn't look back. They were silencing him because he had spoken the truth. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his suite, his laptop open, his phone silent. He had expected retaliation against him. He had not expected they would turn on their own. But this, too, was part of the pattern. Systems built to protect image, not integrity. Deflect, not reform. He updated his report. Staff retaliation detected following whistleblower communications. Ethical breach escalating. The evidence was already overwhelming, but now it had a face. Mason, a kid who hadn't looked away. Daniel picked up the phone and made a quiet call. "This is Whitaker. I need full legal review on site by morning. Whistleblower retaliation confirmed. Expand scope." He ended the call without fanfare and returned to the keyboard. The hotel had crossed another line. The audit was no longer internal. It was about to become federal. That night, the story reached the news cycle. A segment aired on a national evening broadcast. Luxury hotel faces backlash over alleged discrimination incident. Footage rolled. Ethan speaking condescendingly, security escorting Daniel to the side exit. The re-entry an hour later, triumphant but wordless. The anchor's tone was grave. No official statement has been issued, but sources confirm the guest in question may be linked to a corporate oversight body. A representative for the hotel declined to comment. In the comment section of every social media clip, speculation ignited. People shared their own experiences. Some posted reviews. Others demanded the hotel be blacklisted from travel platforms. A hospitality professor published a thread breaking down the violation of guest rights in real time. Daniel read none of it. His focus was on the system's cracks, its silence, its inevitability. Back at the Lancaster Grand, upper management held a closed-door meeting on the top floor. The general manager, the head of legal, Ethan, and 2 regional executives gathered in tight formation. No one admitted fault. They spoke of optics, of damage control, of next steps. Someone suggested offering Daniel a private apology. Another mentioned NDAs, but nothing could be agreed on because no one could admit what had happened. The meeting ended in silence. Ethan remained behind, staring out the window at the skyline. He looked tired now, aged by the pressure of being exposed. Daniel sat at a corner table near the window, dressed in the same understated style, phone beside his plate, untouched. Across the lobby, Ethan stood near the concierge podium, arms crossed, speaking in hushed tones to a younger staff member named Julian. He grinned sharply. "This is what it looks like when you take control. Sometimes you have to push the boundaries to remind certain guests they're not above the rules." Julian nodded slowly but said nothing. His eyes flicked across the room toward Daniel. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "Don't worry," Ethan said. "He'll be gone soon. Some people just don't belong in places like this. Not everyone is built for this level of elegance." What Ethan didn't realize was that Daniel had heard every word, not through proximity but through design. The lobby's acoustics were built to carry softly, and Daniel had chosen his table accordingly. He didn't react. Instead, he reached for his phone and calmly placed a call. On the other end, the response came instantly. A woman answered with crisp authority. He spoke only a few words. "It's time. Initiate Phase 3. Full disclosure." Then he ended the call and slid the phone back onto the table. From across the room, Claire noticed the shift in his posture. Calm but anchored. Her heart quickened. She stepped aside and walked to the staff hallway without a word. Upstairs, in a conference room hastily converted to a crisis center, the general manager reviewed a legal memorandum now bearing new weight. Complaints filed, records requested, subpoenas inbound. The hotel was no longer facing a PR issue. It was facing a systemic exposure. 2 hours later, a black SUV pulled up to the entrance. 2 individuals in formal attire entered the lobby with government IDs and clipped expressions. They asked for the general manager by name. Their presence was subtle but impossible to ignore. Within minutes, staff began texting one another. "They're here. They're actually here." One by one, upper management was summoned to the back. Records were requested, email access granted, guest flagging logs printed. Daniel remained seated in the same spot, slowly drinking coffee as chaos unfurled beneath the polished surface of luxury. Nearby, a mid-level supervisor attempted to delete a file, but was blocked by a system override. A red notification blinked across his screen. Investigative access enabled. Ethan, summoned to the same room, hesitated outside the door. He adjusted his collar, breathing harder than usual. When he stepped inside, the atmosphere was sterile, procedural, inevitable. Inside, the lead investigator offered no courtesy. "We've received multiple allegations of misconduct, racial profiling, and guest intimidation. You'll be answering questions under oath." Ethan's hands shook slightly. His mind raced to recall what he had said, what he had typed, who might have been watching. The problem was everything had been watched, every conversation flagged. The systems Daniel had helped design didn't just detect bias, they archived it. The investigator handed Ethan a stack of printed transcripts. "Do you recognize these communications?" Ethan scanned the pages, his own words looking foreign and hostile in black and white, each sentence damning, each decision indefensible. "I was following procedure," he muttered. The young man favored, instinctively, when rooted in prejudice, "is exactly why we're here." While the interrogation unfolded upstairs, Daniel stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the rooftop lounge. The doors closed with a soft chime. When they opened, sunlight poured in across the glass terrace, the city stretching out in every direction. He walked to the railing and paused there, still, quiet. Below him, the building continued to hum with tension. Inside, policies were unraveling, reputations were burning. Daniel had never raised his voice. He had never threatened a soul. But his presence had triggered the unraveling of a system too proud to question itself. too blind to see its own design. Now, with federal oversight unfolding room by room, he allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. The wind caught the edge of his jacket as he looked out over the skyline. It was revelation, and it wasn't over yet. Back downstairs, Julian returned to the break room and found Ethan's previous words playing back in his head. Not everyone is built for this level of elegance. He sat down slowly, watching the staff avoid eye contact, watching how fear had replaced arrogance in every hallway. He opened his employee portal and scrolled to the complaint system. He clicked the icon. Daniel had remained composed, his movements deliberate and quiet. But today he dressed with intention, a three-piece navy suit, custom-tailored, every fold sharp, the lapel bearing a single silver pin in the shape of a lion's head. He descended to the lobby slowly, phone in hand, and paused before the front desk, where a new staffer had been assigned to replace Ethan for the day. Claire noticed his presence from across the room and instinctively straightened her posture. Daniel offered no glance, no comment. Instead, he dialed a number from memory. "This is Whitaker. I'm in position. Send them in." Then he ended the call and slipped the phone into his jacket without fanfare. Exactly 7 minutes later, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the main entrance, followed by a third sedan bearing tinted diplomatic plates. The vehicles stopped with military precision. From the first stepped a tall woman in a fitted cream blazer, followed by 2 legal advisors in matching charcoal suits. From the second emerged a communications director and a senior risk officer, and from the third, a man in his early 60s wearing a steel gray tie and polished shoes stepped forward. Gregory Hale, Chief Executive Officer of Dominion Ventures International. He walked with a measured stride, neither hurried nor showy, and entered the Lancaster Grand without introduction. The moment the front doors closed behind him, a silent wave passed through the lobby. Daniel remained seated at the corner table near the fireplace, untouched coffee. Gregory approached him without hesitation and extended his hand. "Mr. Whitaker, thank you for the clarity." Daniel stood, accepted the handshake, and gave a single nod. They didn't need to speak further. Staff froze. Claire recognized the CEO from internal newsletters and investor calls. Other employees noticed the sudden presence of legal teams walking into the conference wing, where the general manager was already being summoned. Gregory turned toward the front desk and spoke evenly. "I'm requesting access to the general ledger, guest profiling software, and any internal communications referencing the name Whitaker." His voice was soft, but it carried through the marble and chandeliers like a command. No one resisted. Within minutes, the senior compliance officer opened a laptop at the center table and projected internal records onto a portable display. Every documented incident involving Daniel. Gregory reviewed each slide in silence. His eyes were calm, but his jaw set tighter with every detail. Finally, he closed the file and turned back to Daniel. "They've failed the threshold. We withdraw all pending agreements effective immediately." Gregory's words echoed inside the room like a gavel. For months, Dominion Ventures had been negotiating a strategic investment in the Lancaster chain, valued at $1.6 billion, meant to expand the brand across 4 continents. The final decision had been resting on one final component: operational integrity at the flagship property. That evaluation had been assigned, quietly, to Daniel Whitaker, Dominion's Senior Director of Equity Compliance and Special Asset Strategy. It was his job not just to examine books or performance metrics, but to test culture, policy, and leadership response under pressure. He had done so without announcement, without favor, and the Lancaster Grand had failed at every level. With a single statement, years of projections collapsed, expansion halted, investors pulled their future capital. It wasn't public yet, but it would be, and the consequences would echo through every tier of the organization, from marketing to management to those who had once believed silence could shield them. Back in the conference wing, the general manager stood speechless as Gregory Hale entered the room with Daniel at his side. The GM began to speak, but Gregory raised a hand. "We've seen enough. Mr. Whitaker's report is not only accurate, it is damning. Your team has demonstrated bias, retaliation, negligence, and an appalling disregard for corrective protocol." A lawyer stepped forward and handed the GM a formal notice. Dominion's withdrawal of offer and severance of future negotiations was immediate and irrevocable. A junior staffer entered, whispering that national outlets had just received anonymous leaks of the full audit. Gregory turned toward the group. I suggest your team begin preparing for public disclosure. Daniel said nothing. He didn't gloat, enough to crumble beneath its own weight. Claire stood in the hallway, her breath caught in her throat, realizing the man they had tried to remove now held the future of the entire chain in his hand. Within an hour, Daniel returned to his suite. The sunlight through the windows lit the skyline in soft amber, but inside, the air felt sharper. His phone buzzed. A message from internal comms. Transition team en route. Full statement release scheduled for tomorrow. He placed the device on the desk and walked to the window, where the city stretched endless and indifferent. The work was not personal, but its impact was for every time he had been told to wait elsewhere, prove his identity twice, accept less for no reason. It was no longer about him. It was about systems pretending to be neutral, policies pretending to be neutral, policies pretending to be protection, professionalism masking exclusion. The hotel had revealed itself, and now, so had he. There were still steps left to take. Within minutes, headlines spread. Top investor pulls $1.60 B deal after racial profiling incident. The article detailed Daniel's covert evaluation, outlining how his treatment at the hotel had triggered the withdrawal of a massive international expansion. Social media responded with a wave of support, fury, and disbelief. Guests from other branches of the Lancaster chain came forward with their own stories. Demonstrators, over-securitized. It was no longer a single scandal. It was systemic. A PR crisis became a corporate reckoning. The board of directors was summoned for emergency deliberation. The CEO of the parent company placed a call to the not to ask but to order. Full internal transparency, immediate access to all guest handling records for the last 12 months. As requested, every camera feed was pulled. Footage showed Daniel arriving with proper documentation, offering no disruption, and being systematically downgraded, questioned, watched. In one clip, Ethan could be seen leaning over the front desk whispering to security, then disabling Daniel's room key from the terminal. Another video caught Ethan laughing near the staff break room, mimicking Daniel's posture while making crude remarks about corporate climbers in rental suits. Multiple staff members stood nearby, one even joining in. The timestamp was just after Daniel had been escorted outside. From the lounge, another guest had recorded a private conversation between two employees, laughing about how that guy got kicked out for being too confident. The voice belonged to a senior supervisor. These weren't isolated incidents, they were the casual conversations of a culture that had never been held accountable. Daniel didn't speak to any of it. He let the evidence do the talking. Outside, the media frenzy intensified. A former manager from a Lancaster property in Atlanta gave a live interview, stating she had been pushed out after recommending a black candidate for a front desk leadership role. A former guest from Miami shared a recorded phone call where her reservation was canceled minutes after she disclosed she'd be paying with a company card under her. The Livester name, once synonymous with quiet elegance, now became shorthand for discriminatory policy, wrapped in luxury branding. Online reviews turned savage. Influencers canceled sponsored trips. High-profile partnerships quietly ended within 48 hours. In the war room of the corporate tower, executives debated a full rebranding. One looked at the numbers and said flatly, "We don't have 12 months, we have 12 days." Meanwhile, Daniel remained in his suite, untouched by the noise, watching the dominoes fall from the first small push at the front desk. Back at the hotel, Claire stood before a private investigator hired by corporate legal. She was shown a clip of her own hesitation. At the end of the hall, Julian sat in an HR meeting where he admitted to being pressured to document non-white guests more thoroughly. He recalled Ethan saying, "If someone looks like trouble, treat them like it before they prove it." The quote was added to the official record. Later that afternoon, the regional director entered the lobby and quietly asked for Ethan's badge. He didn't argue. He handed it over, silent, and walked out through the same doors Daniel had once been escorted through. Now without escort, now without defense. In the following hours, Lancaster Holdings issued its first public statement. It included a formal apology to Daniel Whitaker, confirmation of the withdrawn partnership, and a promise of a third-party review. But it wasn't enough. Commentators noted the absence of direct responsibility, the delay in leadership response, and the vague wording around systemic issues. Meanwhile, Daniel's office at Dominion released a brief but definitive statement. "Our assessment has concluded Our findings are under consideration by industry regulatory boards. Reform begins with truth. The message spread quickly, quoted across financial blogs, business magazines, and human rights publications alike. Daniel himself declined all interviews. He remained unseen, but the impact of his presence had become inescapable. Within the luxury world, whispers of internal reviews began at other chains. If this could happen to Lancaster, who else might be next? The signal was clear. Silence and image could no longer shield in. That evening, Daniel stepped onto the rooftop lounge once again, alone, overlooking the sky. Below, the glow of camera flashes continued at the lobby doors, but up here it was quiet. He sat at a corner table, phone resting in front of him, untouched. There was no victory speech, no celebration, only stillness. The work had been done, not with outrage but with evidence, not with exiles, but with unflinching presence. The truth had been unearthed, undeniable and public. The term used in the internal memo was permanent disassociation, due to sustained breaches of equity protocols. Their names were removed from the system by noon, office doors locked, access revoked. Claire kept her badge, but only under a 6-month observation term, her fate still pending full review. Outside, stock analysts had already begun compiling damage reports. Dominion's withdrawal was only the first domino. By the close of market, Lancaster Holdings saw its shares plummet 17%. Within 24 hours, over 100 institutional investors began pulling from future property development agreements. The brand had gone toxic vertical, and no one could spin the numbers to say otherwise. In New York, the parent company's leadership convened an emergency press conference, held not in a ballroom but in a modest legal center. Behind a plain podium, the interim CEO read from a script. Effective immediately, Lancaster Holdings will cease all North American expansion, suspend executive bonuses, and initiate third-party oversight of internal operations. Their eyes betrayed exhaustion. What had once been a flagship of elegance was now a liability bleeding credibility. At the same moment, rival hotel groups sent internal memos to their own diversity officers, warning that one uncovered case like Lancaster's could send their entire valuation into freefall. The industry had shifted. Compliance was no longer a silent formality, it was survival. Meanwhile, Daniel declined to comment. Again, Dominion maintained its statement. No threats, no accusations, just silence with weight. That kind of restraint became its own weapon. What Daniel had dismantled wasn't just a hotel, but the myth that professionalism could be separated from ethics. At the Lancaster Grand, remaining employees walked on eggshells. The signature floral scent that once drifted from the lobby vents was absent. The music played softer, guests moved more carefully. The grand staircase, once a centerpiece for wedding photos and champagne arrivals, now looked like a monument to arrogance. One guest checked out early, whispering to the bellhop, "I don't want to be on the wrong side of history." Meanwhile, Claire spent most of her shift processing refunds. Guests who'd been silent during the scandal now found their courage in cancellation requests and strongly worded surveys. A bride pulled her entire block of booked rooms for an upcoming wedding, citing values misalignment. A professional conference requested venue relocation. No matter how luxurious the furniture or gourmet the menus, the soul of the place had been stripped bare. Even the staff elevator, once filled with idle gossip and small talk, now carried only glances and silence. In a glass tower 4 blocks away, Dominion's strategy division ran projections on how far the shockwave would travel. Other industries began taking notice. Corporate HR departments reviewed their own flagging protocols. Tech companies examined access control policies. Airlines paused upgrades and retrained their in-flight teams. One compliance director said, "If one Daniel Whitaker exists, there might be hundreds watching right now," and he wasn't wrong. Daniel's actions had not only exposed misconduct but redefined risk. Quiet discrimination was no longer an internal liability, it was a market threat. By the second week, university lectures used the incident as a modern business ethics case study. Legal think tanks debated the implications of anonymous equity audits. At the center of it all, Daniel remained untouched, not anonymous, just unbothered. He didn't build a media brand, he didn't start a movement. He simply enforced consequence where no one expected it to come from. The final blow came quietly, in an email sent at 6:12 p.m. to all Lancaster Holdings employees. It read, As part of our restructuring process, all bonuses linked to Q4 performance are suspended indefinitely. Travel reimbursements will be frozen. International staff rotations paused. Attached was a letter signed by the board, signed a necessary recalibration of vision. Translation said mid-tier executives, once smug at gala dinners, now traded panic messages in encrypted threads. How bad is it? Should we leave now? One reply simply read, "He was the audit." The email spread beyond the company, screenshotted and reposted by a whistleblower forum. Within the hour, in boardrooms it was a warning. In break rooms it was hope. The man who had simply sat down and refused to move had, without shouting, moved an entire system. That night, as the hotel's lights dimmed floor by floor, the building felt different. Not empty, but exposed. Daniel had already checked out hours earlier. No speech, no press. He left a single envelope with the new interim GM. Inside was a handwritten note. Integrity is what you do when no one is watching. Reputation is what remains when everyone sees. Do better. The envelope also included a USB drive. It contained a streamlined equity audit template, created by Daniel's team, offered not for profit, but as a gift. The message was clear. Change is not punishment, it's opportunity. Months later, the marble floors of the Lancaster Grand still gleamed, but the echo in its halls sounded different. The lobby no longer felt rehearsed. The smiles behind the desk were no longer forced. Claire now stood at the front desk as lead concierge, not because she survived scandal, but because she chose to face it. Under her guidance, the staff met every morning for 15 minutes, not to review bookings, but to reflect on purpose. Ethan hadn't been seen since the day he surrendered his badge, but his story didn't end there. After weeks of seclusion, public backlash, and a reputation in freefall, he quietly enrolled in a diversity and inclusion fellowship led by a nonprofit focused on transforming corporate behavior. He said little to those in the program, at first defensive, withdrawn. But over time, exposure eroded ego. He listened, he read. He heard stories that mirrored what he had dismissed. And one day, during a roundtable exercise, he admitted aloud, "I wasn't protecting standards, I was protecting bias." Daniel never returned to the Lancaster Grand, nor was he expected to. But his presence lingered in every change that followed. 6 weeks after his departure, the hotel's parent company reached out, not for a second chance at investment, but for permission. They requested access to the audit framework he'd left behind, hoping to use it as a foundation for permanent cultural realignment. Dominion approved the license with a condition. All participating staff would undergo intensive training, developed in partnership with a civil rights organization. Daniel personally donated the first year's funding for the program, but asked that his name not be attached. He had no interest in legacy, only in progress. When Claire received the news, she gathered the remaining staff and said, "This is not rebranding, this is re-education." They agreed. They began with the uncomfortable. They discussed the silent assumptions they had inherited and the rules they had obeyed without questioning. It was not an apology tour, it was a beginning. Julian became a facilitator in the program, using his experience on the inside to bridge the language gap between compliance and compassion. Claire wrote a letter to Mason, now working at another hotel, thanking him for being the first to speak up when silence felt safer. Mason replied with one sentence, "Change without consequence is decoration." Ethan, now nearly unrecognizable from the man who once whispered over the front desk, gave a private seminar at a local university titled, "The Cost of Not Knowing Better." He didn't excuse his actions, he explained them, dissected them, and offered himself as an example of what it means to rebuild. Students didn't cheer, they listened, and when the talk ended, a young man, "You're the first one I've heard say you were wrong without asking for credit." Ethan nodded, unsure if it was forgiveness or something else, but knowing it was real. Meanwhile, the industry changed. Slowly, subtly, but irrevocably. The incident at the Lancaster Grand became a required case study in hospitality schools. Major hotel chains created transparency dashboards for guest treatment metrics. Anonymous equity audits were no longer feared, they were commissioned, and though most didn't name Daniel Whitaker aloud, his fingerprints were everywhere, in quiet policy rewrites and training room whiteboards. In the way a junior clerk now hesitated before making assumptions. He never stepped in front of a camera, never gave an interview. But once, On a panel about systemic accountability, a moderator quoted his note, "Integrity is what you do when no one is watching." The room fell silent. Daniel, sitting in the back, unnoticed, didn't speak. He just nodded once and left before the panel ended. His job was never to be seen. His purpose had always been to reveal what others refused to. And so, the story did not end with a ruined hotel or a public scandal. It ended with people choosing to be better, not because they were caught, but because they were changed. Daniel walked away without fanfare, continuing his work across industries, always quietly, always with intent. Ethan now volunteered with the same nonprofit that had once educated him, guiding others like him through the minefield of inherited prejudice. Claire became an advocate for internal equity practices, consulting other hotels on proactive culture building. And the Lancaster Grand? It was no longer defined by the scandal that nearly ended it, but by the transformation it dared to embrace afterward. Sometimes justice is a trial, sometimes it is a mirror, and sometimes it is a second chance earned not by asking, but by changing. In the end, Daniel didn't tear the system down, he held it accountable, and in doing so, gave it the chance to rebuild something stronger than fear, understanding. The end. If this story moved you or made you think, take a moment to subscribe for more powerful narratives like this one. We release stories that challenge assumptions and reveal truths behind polished surfaces. Tell us in the comments where in the world are you watching from, and which moment in this story hit you the hardest. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Your voice matters. Join the conversation.